Yerumarang, kia ora and hello. Thank you for joining us for the Sydney Dialogues February program. I'm Rae Johnston, your host for today's session. Wherever you're watching from around the world, let me extend a warm welcome from the summit's organisers, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. The theme for our session today is Indigenous Technologies, and the world's first technologies are the sovereign First Nations peoples of this continent, with knowledge passed down for generations despite all attempts to erase it. And as a Wiradjuri woman who was born and raised on Darug and Gundungurra country in Western Sydney, it is an honour to be coming to you today from the unceded land of the Gadigal. And I wish to pay my deepest respects to Gadigal elders past and present, and I extend that respect to First Nations peoples who are joining us today. Now, let me start by introducing our incredible panel, who amongst them have many decades of leadership, activism and guardianship of knowledge. First, we have the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, the Aotearoa New Zealand Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister Mahuta is the first Māori woman to hold the role of Foreign Minister. And when she took the job, she said that she would bring an Indigenous perspective to foreign policy. Next, we have Professor Marcia Langton, the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health, University of Melbourne. Professor Langton has a long history as an academic, activist and government advisor. Amongst her many roles, including that of Associate Provost, she leads the Indigenous Data Network at the University of Melbourne. Also joining us is Sara Stratton, the founder of Māori Lab and a member of the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council for Artificial Intelligence Fairness. Sara's work explores how to bring traditional knowledge to the complexities, concerns and questions that digital technology is raising. It is an enormous privilege to have brought together the unique perspectives of our panellists today. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome.
Kia ora.
Now, the Sydney Dialogue is an open discussion, which we invite you all to be a part of. If you're on Twitter, you can take part using the hashtag #TheSydneyDialogue. Now, let's start by asking for some definitions here. I want to ask, when technology is, I've noticed this in my work as a technology journalist, it's often assumed through a non-Indigenous lens. You know, technology is something that comes from Western cultures. It's something that's modern. It's something that's sprung up in the last couple of decades. So when we talk about Indigenous technology, which is ancient in its origins, what do we mean? I might start with you, Minister.
Well, tuatahi e mihi ana kia koutou katoa. I just want to endorse the greetings that have been offered to all of us. I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora lands and your tupuna, your ancestors past and present, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I also want to acknowledge Professor Marcia Langton and also Sara Stratton for the wisdom that you're going to offer in our conversation today. So the question that, and I'm not sure how well equipped I am to give a definitive answer, but I think if we take it that the first port of call around Indigenous knowledge is the way in which we share our insights and our learned lived experience, but also the knowledge that has been passed down. If I understood your question around definitions, I would say that the definition of Indigenous technology is probably a lot more expensive than a Western view of technology. And I say that very deliberately because if we think about our stories, our epistemologies, the resilience of our ancestors in navigating, in our case, the whole of the Pacific to get here, to bring food sources here, to struggle with intemperate climates and things like that, that whole knowledge base in itself was a system of knowledge, and what came with it was technologies to be able to be resilient, traverse the oceans, get to a new land, be able to, plant new crops. So I take a very broad view about Indigenous technology. I think it is about knowledge systems and applied knowledge. to be able to ensure the survival of your people. We have a saying across the Pacific that is well known, e koreo e ngaro he kākano I rui a mai I Rangiatea. I'll never be lost, I'm a seed cast forth from Rangiatea. And that in itself is probably a clue around a definition of what Indigenous technology is. It's as much as it is of a knowledge base as it is about applying that knowledge base through the use of various technologies over time to be able to survive. So that's my starter for 6.
Perfect. And Professor, how about yourself? How would you define Indigenous technology?
I'm on Wurundjeri country and I acknowledge the Wurundjeri peoples and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I want to say what an honour it is to be with all of you today. With the Honourable Minister Nanaia Mahuta and Sara Stratton, and to have this conversation with you. I think the Minister has given a very important definition of Indigenous technology as one lens of Indigenous knowledge systems and their application, and I couldn't agree more. So what is important to understand about this concept in Australia is that, you know, for so very, very long throughout post-colonial history, the existence of our Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous technologies was simply written out of existence and denied recognition altogether. So this has changed slowly over the last 30 years, but much more rapidly in the last 10 years. So just to give you one really wonderful example, the Budge Bim Cultural Heritage Landscape in southwestern Victoria is the largest aquaculture system in the world, and it is also the most ancient. And it was built by Gunditj Mara people over many thousands of years. And their leaders, particularly Damien Bell and their elders, worked very hard over many years and became the first Indigenous group to nominate their own country to the UNESCO World Heritage List. And so indeed, 3 years ago, or less than 3 years ago, the Budge Bim Cultural Heritage Landscape was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List for its cultural and natural values, and that's very important to understand. So its cultural values include, well, plainly speaking, the largest Indigenous engineered landscape in the world. So I have many more examples to give you, but yeah, how did people build societies and economic systems to enable their communities to thrive, using the available resources in their environment, by observing their environments, understanding their environments over millennia? Well, all of these wonderful examples of Indigenous technology are finally coming to light now because of collaborative research projects, and most particularly because of the deep desire of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional owners to assert the ingenuity and the need to regard as absolutely essential their own knowledge systems and technologies for their futures.
Wonderful. And Sara, how would you define Indigenous technology?
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, he mihi nui kia koutou. I too just want to firstly pay my respects to the Gadigal people and I pay respects to your elders past and present, though virtual, still the traditional custodians of this space where we are right now speaking. I just wanted to say that. Well, big question, Indigenous that's a hard one to define, and technology, big word as well. So my straight off answer was Indigenous technology, technology created by Indigenous people. I thought that's pretty straightforward. And I just also mihi to my fellow panelists. The responses so far are just indicative of that knowledge that we have inherited of what technology is. But I also want to remind us that we're also playful people. So technology, from the beginning of time, there are tools for play that we have. Play slash, they are productive, but they are nevertheless playful. And I just want to remind us of that. And I think when people think of technology today, they think of digital technology, which is pretty recent. But technology is food. It's how we put this bit of food here and that food here, cook it in freezing weather or heat, and what happens then? This happens then. That's technology. So it is knowledge learning. It is exactly to what I heard Professor Langton say about it's about observing and observation, not being quick to rush in. It's what I love about our wānangas, our old learning systems, was that we were put in a natural environment and left to discover original knowledge. And I think that's important as well. I think people forget that we are original thinkers, bold in our thinking, because navigation is not just physical navigation. It is thinking navigation. It is spiritual navigation. It is navigation in every respect. And we have a resource around us to guide us. So Indigenous technology to me simply means, you know, we talk about AI, artificial intelligence, but intelligence to me is because I know I live with those past, present, and to come, I instantly have access to all of that knowledge, all of that insight and perception. That's what I think of when I think of Indigenous technology. It makes me excited. If we can lead, finally and at last, in these matters, what will we produce when, to me, technology, digital technology specifically, is simply a manifestation or the physical representation of what we've believed in anyway, and that is digital technology connects ultimately. It connects and expands. We already knew that, and the newcomers have come and made something physical and called it, there we are, we connect, but we already knew it. So what are we going to create? That's what's exciting me.
That is exciting. And we are speaking today at a Technology, Politics and Society Summit. And in these spaces, most people would be accustomed to discussions of the latest gadget or app that might offer convenience for people, but often at a social, environmental or economic cost, or all three. Do you feel conversations about innovation are focused in the right area? I might stay with you for this, Sara.
When I read that question, the first person I thought of was one of my tribal elders, Pa Māori Marsden. And he said in the 1990s, science and technology might have the know-how, but we have the know-why. If we don't have a know-why, this is what he continued to say, if we do not have the know-why, we will travel nowhere for nothing. And he said, what's the point of making something because you can? Let's just put kaupapa purpose into it. So I sort of start there about innovation. This is a huge conversation. No, I don't think the conversations are geared right. I feel we often, in the mainstream technology, put carts before horses. Essentially, you know, they'll make something and then count the cost, and they never count the real cost. Whereas what Māori Marsden and many, many others say is that you collaboratively work together to first discover what is a need and a possible problem, and then you go about from there developing whatever it is that you're going to develop. So starting at the outset with a collaborative, many lenses looking, multi-stakeholder is a word people say. We do it anyway, naturally. We realise we're part of an ecosystem. So we use the ecosystem to tell us what we're all needing, what we might be missing out on. It's those kind of conversations, and I'll touch more on it further on with the other questions that are coming. But that was my instant thought, was our tribal leaders speaking in the 90s, not about digital technology.
Professor, how about yourself? Do you think that we're having conversations about innovations in the right area? Are they ambitious enough? Should they be pushed further?
I agree with Sara, and I'm glad she used the word ecosystem in relation to technologies. Now, what most people don't understand, especially those people who, out of goodwill perhaps, believe that they're introducing us Indigenous people to new technologies that will assist us, is that already in the Indigenous world, the Indigenous people are using many technologies, including virtual reality, and obviously in Sara's case, working in the field of artificial intelligence. So there are many developments in this area, and there have been for many years. So just to give you one example, across the country we have hundreds of Indigenous protected areas, and they are stewarded by Indigenous ranger groups, that is land management rangers. Many of them, both men and women, are traditional knowledge holders of high status, and that at least 2 decades ago they adopted various forms of technology to assist in their work, especially in relation to mapping and measuring. So, one example is e-tracker. Rangers carry essentially a handheld device to record their coordinates and to register what they're observing, be it weather or population counts and so on. And we have many community-run databases, such as one that I love is Ara Iridija, developed by Anangu people in the Anangu Pitjantjatjara Yankunytjatjara lands, as a community history project, and it's really quite incredible. And there are at least 6 of those sorts of projects in our communities, very, very substantial. I've worked in this area developing databases, and I can show you an example later, perhaps, the Agreements, Treaties and Negotiated Settlements project. For a very long time, it was the only online database of Indigenous agreements and treaties in the world. I think it might remain so today. It's not global. It does cover Australia. We have some information about New Zealand, Canada, the United States, South Africa. But, it's been, like all Indigenous projects, dependent on the availability of funding. But we've managed to keep it going now for 20 years. And that is a wonderful resource for Indigenous communities across Australia. And we use a number of devices, including an interactive map, a interactive database, to make this information available to people, especially in this time of treaty making in Australia. It's become, I believe, invaluable, and I wish more people would use it. So we have these developments. Another one is the Australian Research Data Commons has supported our capability building project, and we'll be looking at hopefully 3 regions in Australia, and looking at exactly what Sara's talking about, the technology ecosystem in each area. What are the capabilities? What technologies do they have available? And of course, what goes missing in these debates is that, external agencies think that we don't have anything. We're always tabula rasa, an empty space. And so They want to give us access to government data. But what we want to do is preserve for the future our own data. So Indigenous data assets are extraordinarily valuable and largely go, again, like Indigenous knowledge, ignored and completely misunderstood. So that is a snapshot, I think, of what we need to be talking about. Individual communities and regions will want to make choices about their technological future. So they need, let's call it a smorgasbord of technologies and capabilities to choose from to suit their circumstances and their own priorities.
Thank you, Professor. How about you, Minister? Do you feel like conversations about innovation are focused in the right area? Is there an area you would prefer to see explored?
I don't think Indigenous peoples lack ambition when it comes to innovation. In fact, the infinite potential within Indigenous peoples to evolve, adapt, innovate, and create new technologies is there. Perhaps the conversation could be better focused around a strong protection regime to enable utilisation of traditional knowledge and knowledge systems, because as the experience in New Zealand is you'll have pockets of traditional knowledge holders who will guard that knowledge because for a certain purpose and reason, and perhaps be very uncomfortable with enabling that knowledge to be used for other reasons which may be appropriated, misappropriated in a way beyond either the consent of the collective or the well-being of the collective, or things like that. So I think the conversation around is not about ambition. The conversation should be about the way in which Indigenous peoples can protect and safeguard while enabling utilisation and safeguarding against misappropriation. And then when you go right to the kind of into various realms of which some Professor Langton has talked about as well as Sara, whether it's pharmaceuticals or marine biodiversity protection or land utilisation methods, there have got to be ways in which the use of that Indigenous knowledge or technology can be better, the value and capture of that knowledge can come back to the collective. And I think that's where fundamentally, certainly in the New Zealand instance, we struggle with mistrust in some areas, especially I think particularly around our natural flora and fauna, and the way, and a real worry that pharmaceutical companies will come and exploit that traditional knowledge associated to rako, our trees, our rau, our various ferns, and then use it in a way that it becomes out of the responsibility, the protective responsibility of that whānau or that hapu or that iwi, and we need to have conversations around that. I'm hopeful that at a policy level, because this is about politics as well, and I have a role in this area within my own portfolios to try and create a bit of a roadmap as to how we might do it with integrity for Indigenous peoples. And the process is important as the destination. So the journey is as important as the destination in terms of how we get there, how we engage with Indigenous peoples around protecting traditional knowledge, and at the same time, Indigenous peoples mapping the way for the better utilisation of that knowledge, of which they have a long-term interest in. And some of the work that I'm doing hopes to map out how New Zealand could get there and uphold the integrity of that traditional knowledge.
It's exciting, important work, Minister. Thank you for sharing that with us. I do want to speak briefly about the connection between the politics of Indigenous technologies and other forms of Indigenous politics. Some of the innovations that come from Silicon Valley, for example, hint at radical politics, things like distributed ledgers for blockchain, or industries like social media that are built on participation from people, or the origins of the metaverse before it became a capitalist venture. But what does a truly emancipatory technology vision look like that draws on Indigenous experience? Professor, can I start with you for this one?
I find, Rae, that many of those discussions are distracting us from the main challenges. And I think the Minister expressed the main challenge very well. The main challenge has to do with policy and politics. And, you know, I'll be looking to developments in Aotearoa in relation to protection of Indigenous rights, in relation to data, traditional knowledge and related matters, because with the expansion of technologies such as AI, the metaverse, algorithms and so on, Indigenous peoples are at risk, highly at risk. Our Indigenous knowledge systems are at risk, and our cybersecurity is at risk, and so is privacy and Indigenous rights. You know, I could go on and on. And what we're keen to do is to work with local communities to develop Indigenous governance arrangements to enable them to understand and exercise their rights to protect their own traditional knowledge, their own data assets. Now, all of these issues are covered in the, you know, the FAIR principles, in the Indigenous sovereignty principles and so on. But, you know, what we need to do really is now democratise Indigenous use of technologies so that Indigenous people themselves are able to apply these principles. And that means, you know, having technological capabilities in order to do so. So this is what we mean by, you know, technology ecosystems. How can any individual Indigenous community corporation operate in this sphere without having access to high levels of capability in relation to technological applications, cybersecurity, and also being able to, you know, invent their own systems, but also have systems, data platforms speak to each other. We have very practical issues to solve, like cloud storage. But, you know, I just want to reiterate, this is about Indigenous governance in the first instance, and bringing Indigenous people into this debate and enabling them to determine their own futures.
Thank you, Professor. Sara, I can see you nodding along there. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, lots of thoughts, yeah. It was, you know, how I even have become involved in this whole topic is when I did my master's, and it sort of became a Māori lens on digital technology, and it honed in on algorithmic bias and AI bias. And when as I'm reading and researching, I'm thinking, this all sounds very familiar to me. What is it? And I thought, oh yeah, this isn't new. This is the digital version of the analog colonialism that we've already seen. Well, not seen, see. And when I finished law school and vowed I was never going to become a lawyer, and it's no offence to anyone else that is, because I saw in my, you know, that the law is like an algorithm. It's embedded with values and vision that weren't mine or ours, if you like. You know, and I saw there are the two basic fundamental differences in perspective. One is the individual right to own anything and anyone. Ours is the collective responsibility for future flourishing. So any tool I'm going to make is going to ensure it's a distribution of resources tool This tool is going to ensure that I'm going to be very rich right now, regardless. So that's a really crude definition, and so I thought back in those days, we need more Māori in decision-making places, and here am I then not becoming a lawyer, but I was young then. And now I think, no, I don't need to join the system. I need to encourage partnership of, I've got my kaupapa, my reason for being, my purpose, others have theirs, and that's what we want. We don't want you to be me and me to be you. And so technology, the disruption of emerging digital technology has meant that great big legacy systems are falling. We've got the opportunity, and I always thought then, and I think it now, is digital colonization is a reality now, where I'm told, if you like that, you'll like this. If the demographic, I'm probably raving, and I'm sorry about that, but
Please do.
So excited. When you mentioned, I'm just going to hop over to this next thing. When you mentioned Silicon Valley, when you look at their demographic, it's no surprise. It's the same demographic as the old colonial demographic. And so it's not going to take a rocket science to predict that what happened in the past is going to be magnified in the digital. If the same demographic only get to embed knowledge, their values, their systems, their way of thinking, I'm always going to get a tool that in the end isn't going to serve me. So of course the answer is include. And now we have a whole inclusion of diversity. One day we'll never have to use those phrases again because we know we just include everyone from different aspects of the ecosystem for input. And in that way, we will then develop systems from the get-go. We won't have to be plastering on, to fix things that are broken. We will hopefully, always there are unforeseen consequences. But I thought, and it's not just Indigenous for Indigenous, I believe our ways of thinking together, all of our ways of thinking together can serve the many. If collective is our vision, then collective is how we're going to carry the people all the way through with us, and if it's not about ownership, but about being a good custodian, a good guardian, what difference can we make then with technology? The whole issue of bias and harm can be mitigated greatly if we can just include and use systems that are already there. We all, various, like our Professor Langton said, with her communities, we've also got our communities that are building our own cloud. We're gathering our own data. We are trying to teach our rangatahi, the young ones, as well as the older ones. We're trying to become digital savvy. We are having now tribal digital strategies. We've clutched onto this and we're running because we know what we can do with it. But it's not just for us. It's we do have a for Māori, by Māori, but I always think it could be a by Māori for anyone if it fits for you. It's an inclusive system. It's not me versus your way. It's we've got this way, you've got your way. How can we agree on ways forward? What do we want out of this? And let's move forward together. I think those are the sort of, we talk about technology, but those are the layers of conversation that need to happen, is always look at who's involved. If it's the same old, Einstein said, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. And I add by the same people. Add a couple of other people and see what happens. Change the whole system. Give us an opportunity to lead some things and let us be wrong, as the mainstream have been wrong many, many times. Let us have an opportunity to lead in something like an AI Centre for Excellence or something like that. Let us lead that, see where it takes us. Let us have the opportunity to fail, test, try again, just like Silicon Valley does. a bit of a rant. I'm
No.
sorry about that.
No apologies necessary. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Sara. Minister, obviously this is an area of expertise for you with politics. I would love to hear your perspective on the connection between the politics of Indigenous technologies and other forms of Indigenous politics.
Well, I'll say right out, everything's connected. You can't divorce Indigenous anything from Indigenous anything else. You know, we go to sleep as, or I wake up as a Māori woman from a small marae in Huntly, Rahui Pōkeka, and my tribal affiliations, and I go to sleep that same person, and it doesn't matter where I am or what role I hold. You bring with you learnings, experiences, knowledge that has been passed down, and wherever you go, you accumulate, and everything's connected. The same with politics. The politics of Indigenous technologies and the politics of Indigenous advancement, whatever that looks like, is all connected. But let me just go to one example. Here in New Zealand, just recently, we have undergone an agreement between the government and Māori around spectrum. And so that it's built on previous spectrum, negotiations, but we've culminated in now a perpetual interest in the allocation of spectrum for Māori here in New Zealand. Now, where that goes, nobody really knows, but the potential of 5G is expensive when you add into that Indigenous innovation. So, you know, the politics of negotiating that outcome and the opportunity space of inserting Indigenous-led opportunities means that in 10 to 20 years' time, who knows what that AI world will look like? Who knows what kind of Indigenous ecosystem will be invested in as a result of that political opportunity that was was agreed. The other thing I will say, and this comes to the point that Marcia raised around governance models, and this is really important when it comes to the interaction between Indigenous groups, peoples, and governments, is that unless we're prepared to find another way to enable Indigenous peoples to lead their own development and aspiration, which does mean a governance type of model, whether it's in data, whether it's around natural resources or whatever, it is the new conversation, and governments will need to be brave enough to at least look to comparative models to say that actually if other countries and their Indigenous peoples have done that, there is a model there that we shouldn't be afraid of, but we have to start with our own Indigenous peoples and seek out what that could look like. That's informative. So New Zealand, you know, we're not saying in our situation we've got everything right, but we have, for example, co-governance, data arrangements with Māori in the public sector, which help to temper the way in which Indigenous data is being collected and then can be used. It may not be perfect, but it definitely is a starting place, and there's definitely ambition within the nature of those governance arrangements to continue to improve. And we do work in a continual improvement kind of environment. Same applies to natural resources. In my own tribe around water, you know, there are co-governance arrangements there that enable iwi to participate and contribute to the long-term protection and restoration of a major river within the area where I'm from. And there are models all around New Zealand. So I think, Marcia, your point about having governance models, I think, is from a political level, is a really instructive point that we can learn from each other on. When I think about Sara's contribution around centres of excellence, the thing that that Indigenous people will bring to the advancement of their own domestic economies will be the innovation. And it's innovation through applied traditional knowledge and epistemologies that is still a secret to governments. Many governments around the world do not know the untapped potential of what sits within Indigenous groups, but they may not have asked, and neither have they bothered to find ways to help Indigenous peoples not just be sitting at the table, but actually co-designing the way in which they're participating, creating the right opportunities that Indigenous people will feel that this is something that we can own, that we can contribute to and be a part of, and not feel like we're getting ripped off. The last point I will comment on is, and it is happening more and more as Indigenous leaders, thought leaders, participate more in politics, is decolonising ourselves as Māori from a learned set of behaviours and norms that have been around an oppressed state. And the moment we can lift ourselves out of being victims into being strength-based, vision-led, have greater confidence in our traditional knowledge base and where that can take us, and that's a big bridge to cross because it's a bridge with intergenerational harm and hurt, but it is a pathway that must be walked to be able to walk over that bridge into the future that certainly our ancestors here in Aotearoa had deemed for us, their descendants. So we've got to decolonise ourselves in order to get to a healthy place where actually it can be, in our instance, Māori for all, and it can be inclusive, and it can be with a lot of social good attached to it. Collectivising the benefits and sharing the opportunities is a very new economic model, I suspect. It's not about the accumulation of wealth because you can't take it with you to the grave. It's about how do you live in a prosperous state. And I always believe, because we've got voyaging history behind our stories here in Aotearoa, I always believe that the courageous nature of our ancestors to travel the Pacific to come here to Aotearoa was based on a mindset that they were resilient, that they were future-oriented, and that the prosperity of that vision would endure, and that they were fearless in knowing that. And I just think that's a gift. That's a gift, and no one can take it, certainly from my kids or their kids, because that's the gift I've been given and that I want to give them. And I don't want any light to be dimmed in that vision, that gift.
Thank you, Minister.
So that's politics 101 though, right? Because there's state politics, there's the politics between Indigenous peoples in the state, then there's Indigenous politics, and then within Indigenous politics, as we all know, there's community politics within your Indigenous group. So everything's connected.
Absolutely. Now, we did touch a little bit in the responses to that question about ethics and about utilising Indigenous ethics as well. So, and over the past few years, we've seen whole subfields emerge in the ethics of technology, and I think in particular around things like artificial intelligence I've heard a lot about, and Sara, as you would know a lot about, that you spoke briefly about earlier. But I would love to hear from you, what contributions do Indigenous ethical approaches make to technology? And I might start with you, Professor, if that's okay.
Yeah, so both Sara and the Minister raised the issue of ownership. Now, this is a fundamental and universal human attribute. So Indigenous people own, particular Indigenous people or specific Indigenous people and corporations or entities own, say, for instance, Indigenous data assets. That is, data assets that they and their colleagues and communities have produced And yet we have no protection of Indigenous ownership of such assets. And this is why I'm very interested in what's happening in Aotearoa. The policy and legislative agenda for this question, the ethical question, is enormous. And in as much as, well, let me say this, in Aotearoa you have a tradition of the Treaty of Waitangi, and everybody's accustomed to it. You have, treaty principles, and you have the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal. Whereas in Australia, the idea that there could be a treaty was ruled out as early as, the 1830s, and has continually been ruled out by governments, colonial and post-Federation governments, and by courts in various ways. And yet we still have treaty-making efforts, some of them official now, in Australia. In Australia, though, we are not accustomed to the ideas that the minister laid out. Co-design, collaborative governance, and you can see how it works in Aotearoa. People live in a treaty mindset. What a wonderful thing, we don't have that in Australia. It's, it's psychological warfare from the time you wake up till the time you go to sleep. And if you can keep it out of your dreams, you're lucky, But we really need to deeply embed ethical principles in the way that we operate in these fields. So one is the recognition of Indigenous ownership and other rights. But here's the catch. What is Indigenous ownership made up of? What does it consist of? It's not like the European idea of ownership. There may be multiple interests in an ownership relationship. The idea of ownership might be culturally defined. And of course, we see that in the way that, Indigenous estates of land and water are envisaged in, say, the native title regime or the various land rights regimes. These too are not like European systems. They are different, and they're based on descent, not acquisition or purchase. They're based on descent. And so clearly one of the principal ethics is, what do you leave to your future descendants? What are you going to leave them? Well, and there's also the embedded principle, Indigenous principle, of leaving to your future descendants, your estate, tangible and intangible, in good order. One has a responsibility in this lifetime not to damage that estate. So how do we build these ethics into a co-designed ethical framework for, living in the digital age? To a great extent, I think Indigenous sovereignty principles have done that, but now the rubber hits the road. How do we do it in practice? How do we design these ethics into our governance systems? And that can only be done, as the Minister said, by speaking to people and developing these relationships and listening to everybody, and co-designing these relationships of governance to ensure that we leave traditional knowledge systems, Indigenous data assets, relationships in good order for the next generation. And this becomes particularly important given the global challenges we face of, vast environmental destruction, climate change. We all have a responsibility to ensure that our work now does not further damage the environment, does not further contribute to climate change. Well, in many ways, these are big, new ethical challenges, and they're not of our making either. So, yeah, this is a big topic, but thank you for asking that very important question.
Oh, thank you, Professor. It is a big topic. We could have a whole hour-long panel just on this topic, I think.
Yeah.
But Sara, I will go to you next for your thoughts on Indigenous ethics and how they work with ethics in technology.
So difficult on the one hand. Again, you can't sort of separate each topic. I will end up saying the same thing to every question. If you have built a tool for a certain reason, say as a commodity to own, buy and sell, the results are going to be, as we've already seen, all technology that's been developed over the centuries and the harm that they create. So what do Indigenous ethics? Also, I hate speaking like that on behalf of Indigenous people, because that means so many things to so many people.
Absolutely.
I always feel like a big disclaimer. I don't talk on behalf of anybody. As a Māori woman, I speak on what I've learned, witnessed and experienced and researched. So I just had to say that. Yeah, the ethics debate, and now there are new roles turning up. Chief Ethical Officer in the AI space. Some of my work with the World Economic Forum was AI and ethics, but really I find that there's an assumption around ethics, that ethics are universal, and they're not, because ethics to me means the same thing as what do you value, and well, what I value will be different. So the multi-stakeholder approach has to apply to ethics as well. And so I'm an AI developer, I decide I want to build something. At that very second, I must be in front of many eyes and ears and minds, and not to receive information and decide whether I want to take on board, but actually insist in engagement and partnership, so that many people start to become involved. Now, I can hear 1,000 million people saying that's impractical, that's costly, but AI, for example, just AI, for example, is such a powerful tool that a bit more caution going forward is the right way to go. And so that's another way of viewing the tool and what I see for it, and it's only ever to be something that's going to distribute the resources where they're needed. It's not for my enrichment. And so ethics starts the very second anyone has an idea and then shares it with somebody else, how they share it, who they share it with, then how is that shared, and then how do they develop that, and then what systems are in place. You know, I don't want to sound like there are some tick boxes that people should go through, but there should be a rigorous building of a framework where people, that might be multi-stakeholder co-created by many people, but certainly there should be, if a car needs a warrant of fitness, I don't know why humans don't, but we need to have a warrant of fitness, an ethical one, a cultural one, a diverse one, whatever you want to call it, if we're going to create and handle and use and operate tools that are this powerful. I think there needs to be a real, and I don't like the word ethics, it's too weird and vague, but I get what they're saying. And just for one example, somebody said to me, you must read this ethics book. And it was, I don't know if I should say the author or not, anyway, because everybody raved about it. It was amazing. It was revolutionary. I wanted to chuck it against the wall within about 2 pages when it said, when it said this ethical thing. People who are overweight should pay more, like people who have heavy luggage, right? And I just thought, heavy? Who's heavy? How are you going to measure that? Who's measured that, and by whose standards? And that was one example. If you take one ethical approach, you're going to get outcomes that do not serve millions of people. So, and then if you look more positively about what Indigenous ethics have already done, so in Aotearoa New Zealand, how has Māori culture positively affected us? We have many examples in the Justice Department. In the justice area, we have the rangatahi, the youth court, we have drug courts. This was developed by Māori thinking, Māori judge, who realised the marae, a communal type of face-to-face justice system might work better, have real rehabilitation, and now it's just become a thing. It initiated victim statements. You know, this is things now that I will see on any cop show now and all around the world, that people have victim statements. But it was actually quite a revolution to include the victim in such quite a personal way in justice proceedings. The environment, as our minister said about her beautiful river, you know, being given a personhood status, you know, this is the difference. We treat our environment like we are related, not like we are related, we are related to it. So not a commodity. We're not just going to buy and sell our grandmother just for the, you know, we just don't do that. So we could say the initial COVID response with our, we say mātou tātou in Māori, that's us and really us, if you like, moving together, united for a common purpose. And when I saw how other sort of English or European countries, colonised countries, were operating and fighting and arguing and protesting, and in that first flush, we all came together. I just believe those are Māori values that we as a nation actually just inhale and exhale without truly really appreciating. We don't measure the value of Māori traditions in our society. We measure sometimes cost and harm and damage, but what about the positives, the value of how we contribute a great deal, and not financially, but just in the way we do things. So, yeah, Indigenous ethics, we certainly, I believe, have a lot to offer, not just technology and in the world of technology, but the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sara. And Minister, your thoughts on Indigenous ethics and where they belong in technology and the ethics of technology?
Yeah, there's a lot in that, and I think both Marcia and Sara have identified just you could traverse all over the place on this question. I'll break it down really simply, because if I kind of touch on previous comments that I've made, if we start with the prosperity vision that our ancestors had for us, the difference, and it would be, in my mind, what is the difference about Indigenous ethics that I think take us to this place of prosperity, whatever that looks like. And I'll give you an analogy. I talked about my river previously, and it is the most developed river in the country. We have got a number of hydro dams along it, and over a long period of time, the degradation of the health and well-being of the river has really changed the ecosystem and the kai that we can get from the river. So in a very small way, the example that I would leave is that my mother believed that in negotiating an outcome for the river, there will be a time that her grandchildren could swim in the river without getting an ear infection or skin rash or things like that. That's a prosperity vision. But how it's applied, and this is where the ethics part of it comes into it, you will see throughout my whole family, everything that we contribute to has in some way is connected to the well-being of our river or to water, because it's a core resource that contributes to the well-being of people, of livelihoods, and we live right next to our river. So our internal ethical makeup, which is very inbred, is not the river as it is now, but the river we need it to be tomorrow and thereafter, and to be the river that we believe there will be a time that we can contribute to its well-being, such that certain kai resources can be restored along the banks of the river, from the flora and fauna to the river life. Now, that ethical framework then calibrates backwards, because then you start asking yourself, am I going to contribute to something that's going to degrade the well-being of my awa, or am I going to participate in something that's going to aid and restore it? That's an ethical framework, however you want to apply it at a very local level. The other thing is the difference will be in our children and their children, because when they go into into Māori land, a Māori land block, is their first thought to cut down all the trees and develop it, or is their first thought thinking about the natural biodiversity and how do I protect what is there, what is important on that whenua to protect, and therefore what else could coexist on my land? Now, a colonised mind, a colonised Indigenous mind might well say this whole land block should be developed. An enlightened Indigenous mind that's operating in a future space that is prosperity-led might look for greater coexistence around, well, a number of well-beings. The biodiversity that's there, the whānau that need to maybe make a living off what's there, being able to sustainably harvest what's there to be able to produce something that the whānau can live off and things like that. And again, I think that's a future. That's the exciting future that I see around how Māori minds are contributing to what things should look like. And I'll come to one last example. Many people know that we've probably got more sheep in New Zealand than our population. Maybe not now. We're about a population of 5 million. But we've got dairy, we've got dry stock, we've got sheep. On one particular land block, because of the nitrate impact on land into streams, I met a person who their sole purpose of going to university was to try and find a more sustainable way to shift their whānau into regenerative farming using technology in order to have a better impact on the whenua, to have a, and the kai that comes off the whenua, but also to have a better impact on streams. That, in my mind, is the futures that we're playing to, that creates a whole different way of thinking about what is ethical in the Indigenous mindset. Because what is ethical is an interconnected set of values that is about the ecosystem, which Sara related to, that is about community, that Marcia related to, that is about intergenerational benefits, socialising those benefits for the long term, and that is climate friendly, And so in my mind, that's why I'm quite excited and will try and work really hard in the domains that I can at a political legislative level to try and ensure, we're bridging. We're doing a lot more bridging around that kind of future. I think there's a lot of hope in it, especially with climate change right on our door.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful example to give there of being able to use Indigenous ethics with technology for the future to make a better place. And unfortunately, we do have no more time left to discuss this today. I would like to keep going for another hour. This has been absolutely fantastic. Mandanguwu, thank you all for joining me today. And thank you all for joining us. It's been absolutely fantastic. I want to thank our Sydney Dialogue audience for tuning in. I also want to remind you all that all of our sessions will be available for catch-up on the website from next week. And I want to thank our Sydney Dialogue sponsors. We've got the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Meta. And of course, a big thank you to our Sydney Dialogue audience once again for tuning in. Don't forget that you can continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #TheSydneyDialogue. Thanks again for joining us today, and I'll see you soon.